Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Policy and Oversight Board this evening. I'd like to welcome everybody that's attending and all of those that might be joining us from the live stream on YouTube. My name is Councillor Lisa Homan and I'm Chair of the Policy Unit and Oversight Board. Before we actually begin the meeting, a few housekeeping matters that I'd like to raise. The meeting is being streamed on YouTube, so by participating, you are agreeing to being involved and consenting in that. If the fire alarms should go off, please leave the meeting in an orderly fashion through the nearest exit, which is on my right-hand side, some of you on your left-hand side. And please do not use the lift unless you need assistance and go down the stairs. If you do need assistance, please let officers in the room know. And could I just ask officers that are here, if you could please introduce yourself when you start your presentations or when you're invited to speak, that will be very useful. So I will now go on to the agenda properly. And firstly, I will ask if there's any apologies for absence. David, if you've got any official apologies for absence. I think Councillor Ree will be joining us later for the voter ID report, so he will be coming later on. And I think Councillor Salus is due to join us any moment. So we might just want to make a note of that. I don't know about Councillor Robotham, I've not heard. Can I ask, are there any declarations of interest that anybody would like to raise? Councillor Perez.
Thank you, Chair. It's actually not a declaration of interest because I've checked with governance, but in relation to agenda item number 4, the update on co-production, following the Disabled People's Commission report, I would like to please, for the record, know that I've recently joined the Hammersmith and Fulham co-production implementation group, which is referred to in the report.
Okay, I don't think there's a pecuniary interest in that, but thank you for flagging it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Chair, sorry. I think Councillor Harvey wanted to register her apologies for tonight's meeting as well.
Beg your pardon, she did want to register her apologies. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Bourne. Okay, that will lead us on to the minutes of the previous meeting. Can I ask if there are any matters of accuracy that anybody wants to raise out of the minutes of the previous meeting?
Chairman.
Councillor Brockbank-Fowler.
Under our brief discussion on item 7, I did raise about in September having a paper on the exam results from our schools, and it was agreed by the Cabinet Member for Education, and it's not noted down here.
I think that was for the children's services pack, wasn't it, rather than for our particular board?
Well,
so,
I meant to come to this, but
okay. I will have to. I think Councillor Robotham was agreeing to it going to her board, so I would need to check whether that is on the plan for that pack rather than it coming here.
Okay.
But we'll get clarification for that for you.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other matters arising that anybody would like to bring up? Okay, subject to Councillor Brockbank-Fowler's points, everybody happy to agree the minutes? Okay, thank you very much. Which then leads me on to the first substantive report of the evening, which is an update on co-production following the Disabled People's Commission report. I'll invite officers to introduce the report in a minute, but I think I was very keen that this should come to the meeting because I am conscious that a lot of fantastic work has gone on in the borough since the Disabled People's Commission, which was the sort of leading force in working in co-production. But obviously it's a much bigger and much wider issue than that. And I think as councillors, we very much want to see it embedded into everything that we do in the borough. And I think we felt, as we really do like doing things with people and not to people, it was important to get an update to make sure that we are moving on, not just from the fantastic work of the Disabled People's Commission, where this sort of was born out of, but just generally in terms of how we co-produce across the council. So I'm very pleased that we're actually debating this tonight, and look forward to hearing what everybody's got to say so that we can learn going forward. So thank you. So first of all, I think I'd like to invite Julian Eccles to introduce the item. Julian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Julian Eccles. I am the strategic lead for communications and community engagement. And actually, there are a number of us in front of you. I wonder if we can introduce them now, because I would very much like to include their participation
Certainly.
in the discussion. So should we just go from left to right as I sit, if that's all right?
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Hope you can hear me. I'm Kevin Caulfield, the strategic lead for co-production, and I share my job with Tara Flood.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you. My name is Jane Wilmot. I'm speaking on behalf of 3 co-production groups that Tara and Kevin have mentioned in their report this evening, and I will be sharing lessons learned.
Thank you.
I'm Philippa Cartwright. I'm the project director for the Civic Campus.
Thank you. I think we have another officer online.
Yeah, hi everyone. Tara Flood. I'm the strategic lead for co-production. As Kevin said, we job share.
Thank you. Councillor Holder, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Councillor Sharon Holder, and I have the pleasure of just being appointed co-production lead for the council.
Thank you. Okay, Julian, back to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. This is very much a co-produced paper itself. So hopefully in itself, it's a model of how we should go about co-production within the team here. Chair, you have completely stolen my initial thunder in explaining the way in which we're going about co-production henceforth. The key word you mentioned there was embedding this process and bringing to life and implementing the reality of doing things with residents, not to them. And this is what this paper attempts to make sure that we have the mechanisms inside the council at accountability level to ensure that this work is being done service by service, accountability committee by accountability committee. So I won't take up too much of your time in introducing this. What we're asking to do briefly is to ask your committee here to come and review co-production right across the council on a regular basis, and likewise each of the policy accountability committees to do exactly the same thing on a quarterly basis as well. We as a team will bring together reports that will come to you and the other committees on a routine basis to ensure we update you as councillors on all the co-production activities on key policy and service issues. We can't co-produce everything, but we will co-produce as much as we can and encourage the services to do this step by step, focusing on the major items. So, and it will become essentially the catalyst for that, both from this committee and also we'll do it at officer levels as well. So that's the simple ask from you to invite the policy accountability chairs to undertake this work. We on our side will do the groundwork at officer level, routinely, methodically, service area by service area, to ensure we get the best co-production, the best consultation, the best engagement from all relevant stakeholders on the major issues affecting the council, so that we can achieve so much more than we already have, and not just rest on the laurels of the fantastic work that has been done already through co-production with disabled residents, particularly, for example, on the Civic Campus and the Town Hall. We have Philippa here to talk about that and others. There's some fantastic work that's been done already so that we can genuinely become a model for others across the country. So that's simply the background. The report in the appendix, I'll leave others to talk about. They have experience of that much more closely than I I do. But we've drawn on the learnings from that to produce this proposal, and recognised that we want, where the rubber hits the road in terms of accountability, we want to make sure that this subject is permanently on the agenda at accountability level from now on. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll try to invite other officers, Kevin or Tara. Do you want to say anything about the report before we sort of invite anybody else to contribute?
So I'd just like to say obviously that since our post came into being in 2019, when we had at that time one co-production activity group, which Jane and Philip are going to talk about. Now we're in a position where we've got 6 active co-production groups across different departments, working on really key issues for disabled residents. I think, as you outlined at the beginning, Chair, that we are moving on, and doing things with residents and not to residents means working in co-production with all residents. And that's the challenge that we have in front of us as the work and residents become more and more involved. I think it's really important to recognise that we need and have been trying to build the capacity of residents to be involved in co-production activities. And that process of capacity building residents and working with residents takes time. And if we're going to really make significant headway, the training that we've already delivered to 3 groups of residents is really key. We've got loads and loads of officers who are really enthusiastic about co-production. We're not always ready with enough residents to be involved in the process. So, yes, I think, as we can see, for example, in the digital accessibility co-production group, that's the first group where disabled and non-disabled people are starting to work towards delivering an inclusive digital inclusion policy. I think, as Councillor Perez mentioned, we've just revitalised our co-production implementation group, which importantly is made up of disabled residents, councillors and officers, so that the decision-making process has everybody in the room, so that we're working together. And that model is, I think, probably pretty unique across the country in terms of local authorities working to include residents within co-production. I think I'm going to hand over to Tara.
Okay, thanks, Kevin.
Hi.
Hi, I know there's not much time, so a couple of other things to highlight. I think the move of the co-production team, myself, Kevin and Rana, into Julian's team, I think will really, help embed the messaging around co-production. So Kevin's talked about the training that we've done with residents. There's also, starting next Thursday, a huge training program rolling out across council officers that will really embed a good understanding around co-production, and particularly the distinction between co-production and other forms of engagement with residents. So when we talk about the work we're doing about co-production, we're consistently using the same description, because I think it can be quite confusing. So I think moving back into or becoming part of comms and a community engagement team, I think will revitalise the work, because it will help us think much more strategically and much more cross-council in terms of how we build a relationship with residents and community organisations, but also other stakeholders, businesses, for example, so that we have a really good, solid approach to working with the community. I think it's also worth highlighting, we're not going to go through each of the 8 recommendations, but you'll see from the report progress against each of them. I think there's something also really important to highlight, how we've been approached over the last 4 years from other local authorities, but also from government departments and community organisations, to help them understand how it's possible to implement a cross-council commitment to co-production, which has enabled us, I think, to really fine-tune why we do what we do. And yeah, it is absolutely about speaking to our commitment to doing things with residents, not to them. But I think it is about making us as a local authority much more accountable to our community and much more transparent in how we make decisions, but also how there is then a sense, I think, of shared ownership around the services that we deliver. And I think that was particularly relevant during the pandemic, when we worked really closely with community organisations to support residents, particularly those furthest away from accessing services, to get the support they needed. And I think we've learned some really good lessons around that is helping us shape how we move forward in co-production. This idea that the council can't do everything, that actually there's an awful lot that we can do to support the community in partnership with the community. So I'll stop there because I know there's not much time.
Thank you for that. So we've got Philippa, who I know has been working very well with residents on the civic campus and making sure that residents, you know, we co-produce what we do there. Maybe you'd like to tell us something about that, Philippa, as an example of something that we're doing, and then I'll invite Jane to come and tell me about all the things she's been involved with, and we can pick it up from there. So Philippa.
Perfect. Thank you, Councillor. As I said, my name is Philippa Cartwright. I'm the project director for the Civic Campus, working for the council. So I started work here about 2 years ago and took over from a lot of good work that was done by previous officers around setting up the disabled residents team, which co-produced the design for the Civic Campus. And you all may have heard about the Civic Campus project through various other means. So I haven't prepared a presentation about the project, but just to say that is the refurbishment of the Grade 2 listed town hall, construction of 200 new homes, along with a five-screen cinema, a cafe, a restaurant, a public square, a rooftop terrace accessible to all. So there's a huge amount going on at the Civic Campus for local people, for local businesses, for visitors, and of course the council's own democratic business. So it's an amazing, fantastic project, one of the first of its kind in the UK. So as part of that, the DRT has been around longer than I've been around, and it is established to co-produce the design of the Civic Campus. So that's everything. That's the refurbishment of the building, the meeting room spaces, the publicly accessible spaces, the toilets, the handles on the kitchen counter, you know, the ventilation systems, the bathrooms in the residential new build, the type of lifts, the carport, the security systems, the public realm, the benches. I mean, I can go on. Our meetings we have every month go on for at least 2.5 hours. We have an agenda in advance, produced 7 days, obviously fully accessible presentations by all. And we will pick 2 or 3 of those subjects during the design period to go through with residents. So the DRT is made up, obviously Jane and I co-chair the meeting. There are a number of residents that represent different accessible needs, and they will talk from a lived experience or talk from their knowledge of the accessible design sector. We also have Proudlock and Associates, who are accessible design advisors. So they really help when we've got like a design coming forward, say for the residential units, and they're all built lifetime home standards where they can be converted for wheelchair users or people with accessible needs. They will advise us and so advise the DRT about the design, because Jane and her colleagues or the residents aren't professionals. They don't have architectural degrees and done all this work before. So we have got advisors to help us. And that's really a key part of the DRT, that it's supported by professionals that work with them to advise them. So our meetings will, sorry, Jane, I'm probably going on, but I can speak about this forever. That's why. So we'll have those meetings. That's the type of thing we will talk about. So the focus is on design. We've been through the planning application. We've been through obviously all the loads of design changes during construction, which have been very interesting. One of the biggest challenges is getting the stakeholders on board. So that means when we're in the construction phase, where I've been heavily involved with, is our builder, all the various partners like A2 Dominion and others who are our housing association partner, is getting them to understand what Julian's talking about, which is co-production is embedded in the council. So it's not something, it's not a talking shop. It's not a place where you just come and do a bit of consultation. It is co-produced with disabled residents. That's what we're doing here. And that took a while, especially for the builder to understand, actually, as you can imagine. But they have done, and they have done it, and they've really come on board with that. So we're very proud of the work we've achieved at the Civic Campus, and it has won an award, actually, and it will go on to win many others. I have to say, on the accessible design part, it wouldn't be what it is without the architects, RSHP, who have really embraced co-production and accessible design. So that they're a huge part of this success too. Some of just the other challenges before I move on to Jane is it's not yes to everything. So that's a really important message to get across to the group, where they say, well, we think we need this and we have to have it because, well, that might not be affordable or it might not be practical. So it's to understand and work with residents that it isn't just saying yes to everything. Training and recruitment, that has been successful and unsuccessful. So we've got lots of members now, but we struggle to recruit and training. It's, they, as I said, they're not, there's some may come from the sector, but some may not. So it's helping them understand how to interact in that environment. One of the things we're doing now, which is not necessarily a challenge, just a note, is just widening the terms of reference for the DRT to include other equalities items. So obviously there's 9 protected characteristics under the law. As we move into operational plans, it's important to look at all of that. So religion, race, etc. And not to just focus on accessible needs. And then the final point I just add, and this is more for us as officers, is around resourcing. It is an intensive process. It does take time. We've employed a part-time coordinator. Obviously, Kevin and Tara offer strategic advice. The people in the project team spend time on this. So it's got to be embedded in our resourcing plan as well. Otherwise, it won't succeed. It will just be, a bit on a bit of paper. But I'll pass over to Jane now, if that's okay.
Thank you. Jane, so would you like to, you've got a real history on this, haven't you? Would you like to tell us how it all came about, and particularly I think about your involvement with the Civic Campus, which I think is probably a really good example of what councils can do if they put their mind to it.
Jane Brimmer, a deaf disabled resident in Hammersmith and Fulham. I'm passionate about co-production, inclusive design, and ensuring disabled members and co-production groups are heard. I'm delighted to be here today to share with you what worked well and lessons learned from 3 of the co-production groups that Kevin and Tara have mentioned. That's 50% of them. So I have a reasonable amount of experience of what is happening at the sharp end. Philippa had given her a good summary of what we receive and the challenges that she and officers face. I'm going to talk about it from a slightly different perspective across the 3 co-production groups. The Civic Campus project is the first example of co-production in action in Hammersmith and Fulham. The Civic Campus co-production group includes disabled members, senior council officers, the lead architect, and inclusive access consultant. We also work very closely with the senior officers responsible for delivering services at the town hall. Because it's not just about design, but it's also about delivering services within the design. The Civic Campus is a group of disabled residents, disabled members, I should say, blind and visually impaired people, people with arthritis in their hands, arms, and legs, wheelchair users, people with autism and neurodiversity. We are all experts with lived experience of the access barriers faced by disabled people. As Philippa said, we are not experts on technical design or technical regulation on public building, housing, or the built environment. So we bring a different perspective. We started in December 2019 and will continue until completion. Lisa asked, the chair asked, if I would give a bit of background. The Disabled People Commission report recommended that the very first co-production project should be this one, which is where we came in. I was determined that we should have co-chairs. So I spoke about it with the councillor, Andrew Jones, and got his agreement that there will be a senior officer co-chair. This is a very important point of principle, because as a lay person, I can't possibly instruct officers, not my job. The senior officer, who's the co-chair, can do that. So what was the impact of the civic campus DRT on co-production? Well, we established principles on co-production that have been followed by other co-production groups. For example, having a senior officer co-chair and a disabled resident co-chair. Having a shopping list of what we wanted to achieve, of the barriers that needed to be mitigated. We paid people for their time. We recommended that their access needs to be met so they could take part at equal terms. And finally, we really strongly supported training of both officers and disabled people on co-producing whatever area they were looking at. I will tell you a little bit more about the training of some of the other co-production groups. So, what we did, the DRT also set the benchmark on ensuring access and inclusion, and being ruthlessly inclusive was embedded in every stage of the journey, from design, specification, completion, and construction to completion. It was a sharp learning curve for everyone to ensure no one dropped the inclusive design ball. For example, we inspired the design team and the civic campus management to manage the contractor responsible for delivering the inclusive design we all worked together on. They became our firm ally. You've heard Philippa mention this. Our common aim is to create a welcoming and inclusive civic campus where everyone, particularly the disabled people, will have the confidence they can have a positive experience whenever they come to the town hall. It sounds simple, but you wouldn't believe how much effort is involved by everyone, particularly officers, Philippa and co, to ensure that it actually happens. This pioneering approach has ensured that the civic campus, Hammersmith and Fulham, is really, truly, ruthlessly inclusive and will set the standard for others to follow in future. I'm co-chair with the Assistant Director of the Environment of the Safer Cycle Pathway Disabled Resident Team. This is where I'm being honest. This DRT did not start well in 2021. Officers originally thought that holding a co-production meeting was co-production. When the council had already decided on the design of the Safer Cycle Pathway before the very first meeting. Officers tended to overpromise and underdeliver. They did not explain what was within the gift of the council, what mitigations were within the gift of the council, within the gift of Transport for London, or within the gift of the Department of Transport. There was a lot of fudging going on. But 2 years later, what is working well? Training transport and highways officers on the transport needs of disabled people, delivered by disability organisations. This has made a huge impact and actually got teams talking to each other. Been quite interesting. Collecting feedback from disabled residents on the safer cycle pathway that was included in the cabinet report. Appointing an inclusive access consultant to provide technical advice to transport and highways officers to supplement the lived experience of disabled residents on access barriers they face. Now, this is the final one. Having an assistant director at co-chair has made a huge difference. It is the AD who could ensure officers attend co-production meetings. Actually do consider mitigation to barriers faced by disabled people. Do use training provided to deliver inclusive development projects that we can all be proud of. The cycle pathway is now permanent. There are many conversations going on about how the DRT move beyond just cycle lanes. There's a need to go beyond, really think about some of the transport and highway projects, but there are millions of them. So the discussions are really around how do we manage all that and do co-production. So the final example I've got is the Disability Forum Planning Group, now about to be renamed the Inclusive Design Review Panel. Our role will be to working with council officers to inspire developers to deliver inclusive design, embed inclusive design throughout their project, and not drop the inclusive design ball. They're not used to being challenged. Developers are not used to being challenged in this way. So it's going to be quite a challenge, but we only meet once a month for a couple of hours. So really what we are really doing is opening the door for the planning officers to follow up. But they're the ones who have to do the heavy lifting. We don't do the heavy lifting. However, this co-production group does not currently have a co-chair. This means progress in working together is sometimes a bit slow. But let's leave it there. I've got 3 tips for you as committee chairs. I support the proposal for regular report and co-production groups to PACs. Great. But what matters is that these reports provide information on the barriers identified by disabled people, progress on how the group work together to mitigate those barriers, to achieve outcomes, rather than just a general report and progress, which we've already seen many times before. It might be a good idea to invite the co-chairs to the PAC meeting to supplement information provided by officers. The officer co-chair of the co-production group has a very important role in supporting the disabled resident co-chair and disabled member in achieving their objectives. Finally, this is something that goes back to what Julian and others have said. It's really important that this is a priority to change the culture to so effective co-production of meeting the needs of disabled residents become the norm across the council. What I'm talking about is embedding co-production everywhere. It's about picking up department by department. I feel we made good progress with Transport and Highways team because 2 years ago, they were nowhere. Today, some of them are doing well. Others are still unreconstructed. But because of the training, I'm hoping those who got the message will support others who need to be brought up to speed. People have been brought up to work in a totally different way. They haven't been brought up to do co-production. Thank you for listening to me. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting to hear that, you know, things are going well, but there are some things that didn't go so well and that we are learning as we go along. So I think it's really good that we're learning. And I think the message for me, which is one of the reasons I've wanted to look at this, it's about embedding it and embedding it with consistency, and it not just being a tick box exercise, but it's actually being real and working on the ground. So I'm going to shut up and let the committee ask some questions now. And I've got quite a few of my own if nobody else asks them. So can I ask who'd like to start off with some questions? Anybody? Councillor Pell.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much all for your presentations and your updates. It's fantastic to hear that the administration is part of this process and we're leading the way in terms of that change. Hopefully it will be implemented by others as well, but still I'm keen to know what can we do better as an administration as well. So my question is, what would you say are the top organizational barriers to further expanding co-production across more services in the council to bring residents closer to decision making?
Who wants to go with what the biggest barriers are? Julian.
I think it's a very relevant question, to be honest. As I think as we've all acknowledged in the room, there's plenty of scope for improvement here. And I think we've identified already one of our big roles as the internal catalyst for improving co-production is an exercise of persuasion of some of our own closest colleagues. I think where we have to do is a shift from thinking this is a pure philanthropic exercise, which I think some still do, potentially, to demonstrate that co-production leads to better policy making, better delivery for residents, but better financial efficiencies. We can actually make savings as well. So just imagine, as Jane and Philippa have mentioned, if we'd gone ahead at the Civic Campus and designed it with all types of furniture, fittings, accessories, and so on, only to discover that they all had to be replaced because they were unusable by a significant segment of the population. You can prevent that happening by making sure you instill and embed co-production at the earliest possible stage. You get better policy making, better outcomes for residents, and better financial efficiencies as well. And I think we have a persuasion job to get from that point of moving from philanthropy, if you like, pure cosmetic exercise to demonstrating it leads to better policy making. So I think there's that's part of the cultural philosophical barrier we have to come through to recognize that is a given fact. There are multiple others as well. You could point to individual services. Obviously, public realm is a very big and highly visible one as well. So, without doubt, we'll be paying special attention to that. But I think that is the main shift, I think, is in people's minds at the moment. I hope that answers it partly, at least.
Thank you. Anybody else in a minute? I'm going to barge in with one of mine then. I was very interested in what you said, Philippa, about the builders and actually trying to have builders kind of shift them in culture, because we obviously do a lot of business with contractors, with outside organisations that we rely on to deliver services. So I was quite interested in how you shifted that. And I wonder what lessons there are in that for all the other departments with all the various services that we provide, and what we should be looking out for as councillors in terms of making sure that we do that consistently across services.
I think it's just that point that we're the client, so we're paying, and this is what we're stipulating we want. And the DRT has sign off. So this type of contract we have, and construction contracts are different perhaps from other service contracts, but they have to follow what we've told them. So if the DRT have sign-off principles or rights, then that gives them the DRT authority. And I think that was a bit of a that was a change for them, because they weren't used to having to go through so many, different hoops with that. The other thing with the builder was just getting them to understand why it was so important to us. So that was speaking to their director, so their family-owned company. So we brought them in, spoke to them about it, got them to understand why this was so important to us. I think we had to win hearts and minds actually with them a little bit. So it's part contractual, part kind of relationship, I'd say. Jane, I think, wants to add something to that.
Thank you. Basically, the contribution of DIT to this process, I was very anxious that contractors were not embedding inclusive design or inclusive thinking. So I had a bit of a discussion, and the discussion ended up with the council writing a statement that went to every consultant, every contractor, saying, this is what we expect of you. We expect you to think inclusively within your own area of expertise. And and the officer carried that out. So really, we set the tone that this needed to be done.
So that sounds very much like something we could write into lots of other things that we do, and we could learn by that example. So that I think could very well be one of the action points from this evening. Councillor Daly.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for those kind of presentations. That was really interesting. There's some phenomenal work and some real determination behind the co-production here, and the progress that's been made is inspiring, and it's clear why so many officers and colleagues are really engaged with it. I am very aware that I don't know all the ways council services are disabling residents. And I've got a really practical question, really, which is what I can do, how I can bring this to PAC in a way that's effective and useful. I've taken a note of Jane's 3 tips there. So identifying barriers and inviting the co-chairs and changing the culture. But I'm really interested, would it be useful to ask officers to include a section on co-production in every report that I'm asking for? Or should I be expanding in our values part of it and having it like that? Or should I be bringing independent reports from officers on it? And how would, second question, follow-up question, how would those sections of the reports be picked up and used and be useful for kind of future co-production and for reporting back?
That's all quite structural.
Very structural, but I'm kind of, I've been really inspired by every time we've ever touched this, and I really want to be able to sort of make a difference. And I just want to know some of those kind of really very practical steps that I can do as a PAC chair that will get us there, that will embed it, because I think it's really important.
Yeah, I think that's definitely some of the recommendations we want to get from this evening. So, Julian?
I think it really needs a focus on the major policy and service delivery areas to identify what the major service areas are, policy area by policy area, and for us to concentrate on where the barriers are within those. So we're asking for a quarterly consideration, so that matches the frequency of the committee meetings, so every one effectively, and having a co-production item on the agenda that doesn't necessarily reflect every single other item on the agenda, but that it looks in the round at how the service area responsible is performing and what the key service delivery components are within that. And we will provide essentially, I don't want to call it a checklist because we're not in the business of checklist, but to assess how well we're doing in co-production targets and co-production activity. I think this is going to evolve, frankly. I mean, we are learning too, actually, in making sure that this accountability happens, like from the top down level with the elected politicians scrutinizing this area. And in a way, we're feeling our way with this, but wanting to make sure that there's pressure there on ourselves to make sure that we are on the main service areas, looking at how we co-produce those and preparing for the future as well. on the major items. As I said before, we can't co-produce everything. That would be ludicrous. We'd be too diluted. So let's go for the main big ticket items, and maybe leave it to each PAC committee to think about which ones are the most important to examine. And then we will then, do the groundwork with officers from the relevant teams to prepare an assessment, an office assessment of how well we're doing and where perhaps we could make improvements. But I think we're going to feel our way. This is a new beginning for us as well.
Thank you.
Councillor Salif.
Thank you. My role is I'm the chair of the Social Inclusion and Community Safety Committee. And as part of it, we spent quite a lot of time talking to the police and understanding how they work and what they're doing internally, for example, in terms of training, to deal with all sorts of residents from different backgrounds, including disabled residents. I was just wondering if anyone from the panel could tell us whether you're working with the police or whether there is something you could be doing to showcase and give them examples of what works well in the work that we do as a council that they could perhaps learn from, or what we did and perhaps didn't work in the past, we have learned from it and they could learn as well. Thank you.
Anybody want to attempt to say how we could work better in co-production with the police? Anybody want to take that one on?
Well,
No.
I'll give it a go. I'll give it a go.
Perhaps, Councillor Sleep, you could invite the police to your PAC to ask them that question, and invite some of the people here this evening that have kindly given us lots of useful ideas and information to make a contribution of how they could work better in co-production.
Well, yes, I mean, I wasn't trying to promote my next meeting, but our next meeting will be inviting the police and asking them about how they're dealing with interacting with different groups in the borough. So it would be absolutely a benefit to have organizations working with disabled people and our own in-house teams to come and contribute and give best practice advice to the police.
Tara, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Just responding to that question. I do know that the Safety Net People First, which is the local organisation run and controlled by people with learning difficulties, has done a number of training rounds with local police. But I think it's a great idea. We'd be very happy in whatever capacity you think would be most appropriate to talk about the work that we've done, but also to do that thing that Jane has done so well, being honest about what works and what doesn't. I think talking about the organisational barriers as we have been and how we've overcome those, but also sharing the resources that we are using and that we can use more effectively around the checklist, the co-production checklist, because it's not, although it's called a checklist, what it really is a framework for supporting co-production to take place. So ensuring that officers ask themselves the right questions at the right time, including what are the barriers, what might some of the barriers be, and then actually supporting officers to use those checklists, and then have a discussion about what worked and what didn't with those checklists. Because I think I agree with Julie in this idea about feeling our way a bit, in that we are never going to do everything first time absolutely perfectly, as long as we learn along the way and we can then share that learning. So we'd be very happy to have that conversation.
Thank you. Jane, did you want to come back on that particular note? Councillor Trey and then Councillor Vaughan.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you for your presentations, because you've really brought to the table for me and highlighted how important it is. Because in a way, we get the kind of assumption that the public space is going to be developed with the whole diversity of people in mind, and to bring it down to a checklist is actually really important, because a lot of things aren't done with everybody in mind. And I think there's a lot of assumptions. So I really appreciate you bringing this today, because, I'm chair of the Climate Change and Ecology PAC. And again, I need to learn how we bring co-production into every decision
that's made. So it's been really useful for me. So that isn't so much as a question, but as a thank you. But going on, the Nikos's point was really important actually, because I think it segs into policing and health. Particularly, I think the Metropolitan Police have written a warning that they won't be at the front line of dealing with mental health calls going forward, that they're asking actually health to be at the front line of mental health calls, and that's going to be, you know, over the next 6 months. And so we really, you know, the policing really does matter. You know, people with neurodiversity have to be helped in our culture, not helped. That's a sort of a disabling word, sorry, but have to be considered. That's the word. So I don't know if any of those points. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody wants to respond to that. It's an interesting comment, and I think it's quite pertinent to the health pack as well. It's very cross-cutting. So maybe it's something we need to come back and look at here if we don't manage to get it anywhere else. But certainly a very good point. Councillor Vaughan, I think you wanted to come in.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, just to thank Kevin, Tara, Julian, Philippa, and everyone else who's come tonight. I think extremely interesting presentation. Obviously, lots of good work going on day in, day out over a number of years now. I should say that you did prompt us all to talk about co-production about a year ago, and I have been asking about it at each of our PAC meetings on each of these reports. Getting somewhere with it, perhaps. I think this discussion tonight's helpful in sort of informing us all about what you're aiming for. I just wondered, and it sort of comes back to what you were saying, Julian, I think, is from what I understand, I suppose there are 6 sort of formal co-production activity groups at the moment. Clearly, they cover some major projects. The Civic Campus being the most obvious example, and the one, you know, some of the ones that Jane has taken us through. And you mentioned, obviously, Julian, that it won't be co-production on everything that, you know, sort of everything that council does. So I suppose my question is really about strategy, which I think it's just putting together some of the pieces that you've talked about tonight. Is how will it be identified which are the major projects, or what ideas do you have about which major projects that you want to do a sort of full co-production on, which would involve a disabled residents team or a team of disabled and non-disabled residents doing the sorts of things which are monthly meetings, training everyone up, and sort of doing that on a major project. And what will be, it seems to me, the sort of checklist idea, you know, framework idea seems to be more a sort of, don't like to call it sort of co-production light as such, but obviously you're not going to be able to do, presumably, the sort of full monthly meetings, lots of people trained up for everything. So I guess I know you said earlier, feeling your way, and absolutely, clearly that's presumably the answer, but I just wonder how you're going to select the sort of full, so several things. How do you select the full ones against the sort of more the framework ones? And then how do we establish sort of training and also recruitment as part of all of that? Because presumably there will need to be, I think you mentioned it here, obviously training of officers, training of people who are on the co-production activity groups, and also how do you recruit meaningfully those people who are going to be on those activity groups?
Thank you. On the training and recruitment, I think the best people to answer that would be Tara and Kevin, so maybe we can come back to that in a moment. They're much closer to it than I am. On the point about identification of which are the service areas we should focus on, I think we need to be guided, frankly, by some of the advisory groups on this, first of all. It shouldn't be up to us by ourselves to decide, but it should be up to them to advise us on which ones are the major ones. But as a starter, I would suggest looking at some of the main commitments from the manifesto and the business plan, for example. So we have well over 200, I think, commitments in the business plan. Looking at some of the major ones from those to see where it's right to have a full co-production process. Some lend themselves very obviously to that, others not. And then look at the more routine, regular service delivery items, whether it's waste collection, street cleaning, highways, major permanent, if you like, features of the council's activity. So it'll be a combination of looking at those, if you like, the routine services, as well as those that may be coming through with the current business plan based on current administration manifesto commitments. And on training and education, sorry.
I'll bring in Kevin probably to talk about recruitment. I was going to say, Councillor Vaughan, that I think also identifying things on the business plan, and Matt Sells might want to say something about this at some point before we finish this item, by identifying things coming through on the business plan for your individual packs. There may be some in there that you want to go, oh, hang on a minute, have we involved co-production at the very beginning of this? Is there time to, do you see what I mean? So there, I think by looking at what's coming through and looking at what those business plan asks are, we might be able to be a bit more proactive as policy and accountability people on that. Matt, do you want to say, because I think that's one of the things we talked about when we were thinking about this report, wasn't it?
Thank you, Chair. So yeah, the business objectives 23-24, which was agreed by Cabinet in September, I believe, last year, that contains 140 odd of the commitments made by the Labour administration in their manifesto. So yeah, that could be reviewed to look at what are the priorities for co-production. That does contain quite a mix of different types of things, though. That was the only thing I would say, and I wonder if there might be a layer above that to look at and thinking about those key kind of strategic frameworks and strategies for the organisation, those things that perhaps where we should be planning ahead for co-production.
Thank you. So Kevin, do you want to come in on the training point?
I was just going to say that we, as a council, have adopted a vision for independent living, which is really, really significant in that we're the first local authority in the country to develop a vision for independent living, which brings together many of the barriers that people have been talking about. So education, health, personal assistance, income. So although we've got a vision, and one of the new independent living will be the new independent living delivery co-production group. That's being recruited to now. That will start just strategically to bring together some of the barriers that we need still to challenge. The training, I think more and more of training is going on. As Jane said, there's much more practical training in planning, in highways. We're doing much more work with capacity building and training residents to be involved in co-production. And as Tara said, we're just about to start the council-wide training on disability equality and co-production. So I think we've got lots of growing pockets and green shoots. And we've started to work with people and talent on a strategic training plan because lots of training was happening in transactional situations on particular issues. And we're starting to work towards a much more strategic training plan, and also working with workforce development officers in different departments to try and coordinate training in a more constructive way. I just wanted to say on the co-production checklist and guidance, it is a checklist, but it's a planning document for co-production that officers are using to plan on their particular service delivery or policy change. But that could also be incorporated in policy and oversight to help with the discussion about the nuanced work that's been going on in co-producing a particular service. And as you can see from Jane and Philippa's description, it is the nuanced, nitty-gritty work that brings about the change. And it's really important not to miss that.
Thank you. I think Councillor Holder wanted to come in.
I just wanted to add a couple of things. I think what we cannot, none of us should forget, particularly as we're talking about policy and accountability, is that actually we all have a responsibility around disabled or disability under the protected characteristics and the Act itself. And that always has existed, well, has done for some while. So that should incorporate everything that we're doing. And certainly in future equality impact assessments, which are part of all of our reports, that can be added to that. It's just, you know, just to round things off, really. Thanks.
Thank you. Does anybody else from the committee want to? Certainly.
I would like to say something as a disabled resident. In answer to Rory's question, the reality is you need to focus on what matters to disabled people. What are the issues that they want to see addressed? And that will help you navigate the different, all the 140 items you've got in the business plan. I do think that we can't do everything. What's important is to focus on what we think are important. Housing, very important. Frankly, it's the best. So we need really good co-production there. We need the housing department to really listen to disabled residents and to use the housing policy group they just established or about to establish, I can't remember, to actually drive it forward. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. I've got one more point before I think I bring this item to a close, and that's, I don't know of anywhere else it does it quite as well and is quite as well advanced as we are in Hammersmith and Fulham. I'm just wondering what we're doing to get out there and say what we're doing and actually make a bit of a fuss about it, because I certainly am aware of the group that's been working on the civic campus. I know that there's a disabled residents housing implementation group. I know that I'm aware that there have been other groups going for a while. We had obviously right at the very, very first meeting of actually the second meeting of this board, we brought the digital inclusion strategy, and we had somebody come along from, you know, a group that had been working with residents on that. So there's a lot of good stuff going on, but what are we doing to shout it from the rafters, even though we're still learning?
Shall I answer that? I think as Tara mentioned earlier, it's good that community engagement co-production is allied now to the communications team, because this is exactly the kind of thing we like communicating, helping residents in these areas. The best example, I think, is the civic campus activity, where we have won awards, where we've been promoting the work that we've done there in housing media, architecture media, engineering media, and those. And what I've urged us all to look at is the practical outputs from those discussions, those groups, what physical actual changes have been made in various locations, what differences are making to individuals' lives to give it real color, to illustrate that this work is having a real impact on people's lives. And that's always been my request, actually. Show us the difference. Don't give us the talk, show us the walk on these issues. And at times it's been challenging. We need to get those outputs there and to move from the fact that we have, you know, a great infrastructure of discussing these things, to move on from that to the delivery and showing the difference it's making. Civic Campus is the best one. I mean, when it opens and leading around that, we have a whole agenda to showcase the inclusion elements of that as an exemplar for the rest of the council and others besides. For the independent living and in the housing, that any changes made again in design and architecture and so on, we're quick to shout those out to, you know, to the right media and to play it back to residents as well. But we need more of them all the time. We want to keep that engine turning to make sure we have a good regular drumbeat to demonstrate how well this is working in practice.
Thank you. Philippa.
No, I think we want to win some more awards as well, don't we, Dame? I think that's what we want to do this year. I think all our partners are engaged with that. So the Civic Campus, as Julian says, we really want to lead with the co-production story, and I think it will catch not just headlines locally, but nationally as well. So I think we are doing something really different for the first time.
Thank you. I have to say that it's really difficult sometimes for somebody like myself to actually imagine what the barriers are, whether it's barriers because you've got a disability or whether it's, you know, one of the other protected characteristics. It can be really quite challenging. And as members of the pack know, last time I was sat here with my arm in a sling. And it's amazing the different view that you get of the world just trying to negotiate things when your arm's out of action. And so I can't imagine what it's like. You know, it's really good that we've got people that can actually make us aware of these things when we can't become aware of them ourselves. So I just want to say an enormous thank you to everybody that's contributed tonight. We've obviously come a long way, but we've got a lot more to do. I think the recommendations are really for the PACs to receive regular updates on things within their areas. And certainly I would expect that to happen pretty much at every PAC where there's a relevant item. But certainly I think this board needs to get regular updates so that we can monitor where we are, whether that's twice a year and whether it's a very short report or whatever. But I do think it's really important for that to come here so that we can keep an oversight of it. The other couple of things that I've picked up is I think there is obviously a big role with our contractors going forward. I think there's some lessons that we can learn there. What can we embed into our process of when we're letting contracts? And the other thing, which is probably the hardest one, we've obviously mentioned partners, and we particularly mentioned the police. What we do within the council and how we define which policies, etc., may be particularly relevant and lend themselves to have co-production is one thing, but how we do that with partners and bring them on board is a whole new challenge. And I think that's something that we might want to think about in certain areas. I'm not quite sure how it's achieved, but all contributions to that welcome, and hopefully the various chairs here can give that a little bit of thought as well in terms of how we take that forward. So I think that's kind of my thoughts and my recommendations of what we take away from the meeting this evening. And I just want to say again, thank you so much everybody for coming along. It's been really interesting. I'm looking forward to having a tour of the civic campus and somebody pointing out all of the things that you managed to get changed. Okay, thanks very much, everybody. We'll just take a sort of 2-minute break while we change officers. So thank you for coming. Thank you, Jane. Okay, everybody, can we settle down now? Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, the next item on the agenda, item 5, is the introduction of voter ID requirements. As probably everybody in the room is aware, for the local elections that took place in many parts of the country earlier this year in May, the new voter ID requirements came into force. So we thought it'd be really interesting to have a report about what might be learnt from those elections in terms of how we do it going forward in Hammersmith and Fulham. So I asked for a report about this, which officers will present. But before I start, I think Councillor Toulouse would like to say something.
Yes, apologies. I should have said earlier, but I came late to the meeting. Just a declaration of interest. I'm employed as the agent for Hammersmith and Fulham Labour, and I work sometimes closely with Zoe and her team. Thought we'd put that on the record. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So I think we will move straight on. And Zoe, would you like to introduce the report that you've provided to us? Thank you.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Sorry, if you could say who you are, particularly the officer sat next to you who doesn't have a name tag.
So my name is Zoe Wilkins. I'm the Electoral Services Manager for the council. And this is
Kayode Adewumi. I'm the AD in charge of elections.
Thank you. Over to you, Zoe.
Okay, thank you. As you very kindly explained, the Elections Act of 2022 introduced a requirement for voters to produce photo ID in order to obtain a ballot paper in polling stations. That ID is specified. There is acceptable ID and there is not acceptable ID. There is a list that was sent as an appendix to the agenda, so as an appendix to the report. Broadly speaking, there are 3 real challenges for us as councils to deal with this new requirement. The first is that we need to make sure that our buildings, the venues that we use for polling, are accessible anyway, but also in terms of the voter ID, that there is room to conduct this little bit of extra administration. And more specifically, that voters who may wish to have their ID checked in private are able to do so. Now, anybody can request that they have their ID checked in private. They don't have to give a reason, but obviously typically we might be thinking about perhaps ladies who veil or people who just don't want to have their ID and their face and name perhaps necessarily checked in a kind of a public manner. So that's the first thing. We need to make sure that we have the room to do that in our venues. Secondly, we need to recruit and train our staff so that they are aware of all the new rules, how to apply them so they're applied fairly and consistently, and also so that they can support voters who might need a bit of extra help and understanding the process in the polling stations themselves. And then finally, and perhaps the most importantly, we need to ensure that our residents are aware of these new rules, that they know what kinds of ID are acceptable, they remember to take that ID with them to the polling station, and in fact, if they don't have the right kinds of ID themselves, that they are made aware of how to get it for free from us, because we can provide these things called voter authority certificates. And obviously we need to ensure that anybody who needs one of those is able to get hold of one in good time for a poll, so that there's no sort of panicking and worrying close to polling day itself about whether or not they'll be able to find something on the day. So taking those 3 in order then, just to expand a little bit, our venues, obviously we are reviewing all of our polling venues at the moment. Just informally, we've gone to visit all of them so far, bar 3, I think. We're waiting to just get into 3 of our new stations. We are aware of 3 that need to be replaced for next year because they're unavailable. So far, we are quite happy that the venues that we use will, 1, have the size of room to accommodate this extra check, and or they've either got room where we can have a private area, perhaps like this area behind me with a screen behind it, or a separate room. So that seems to be going fairly well so far. The second issue is around staff and their training and their needs. And some of them, frankly, have been a little bit worried about what might happen in polling stations. So there we're looking to do some question and answer sessions. We'll be doing those starting next week, actually. So evenings and lunchtimes, people can drop in and ask us questions. We're sending them some sort of newsletter type things, some sway, just letting them know these are the new rules, this is what's happening, this is what we understand has happened elsewhere. Touch on that a little bit in a moment. So we are already starting to recruit and say, are you available next year? All of those kinds of things, because obviously we are going to need a few more people probably to deal with this extra admin task, certainly in our bigger stations. And so we just need to make sure that we have a big enough team that is feeling confident and well trained and understands the job that they have to do. And finally, and as I said, possibly most importantly, voters, we are aware, of course, that voters were turned away at the local elections in May. That's because they didn't have acceptable ID with them. Now, some of those people would have gone away and then come back. But as I understand it, it was about one point, about half the people who were turned away at stage one then came back with their ID. But that means about half didn't. Now, at the moment, we don't quite understand the reasons why that might have been the case. We are awaiting an Electoral Commission report on all of that, which hopefully will give us some clues as to why that happened and who these voters were in particular. But we are aware, of course, that this is more acute, it's fair to say, in urban areas. So we're an urban area. We need to think about why that might happen or not happen to us, and how we just go about ensuring that our voters do have their ID with them and they know where to get it if they don't currently own any of it. So voter awareness, as I say, is critical. We are hoping to minimise the people who lose out on their votes by providing a good communications and engagement plan. We're providing A5 flyers in all our voter registration materials in the forthcoming annual canvass, and that will be setting the scene. We will be continuing with our social media campaign. We will do some paid for and kind of targeted, if you like, social media campaigning as well. Again, that will depend a little bit on the research that gets thrown up to tell us who we need to aim that at. So we're keeping our powder dry at the moment on that, but that is something we will do coming up towards the elections. We will provide further information in the council tax booklet and the winter booklet as well, and so forth. So all of that, of course, costs money. Now we will get some grant funding, or we've had some grant funding from DLUC, currently at about £10,000. We know that they will provide us with some more money for additional staffing and things like that in April next year. There will be more money coming from them, but we don't know how much at this point. So we don't yet have figures for that. We also know that some of the stuff that we need to buy around voter ID, so for example, hand mirrors, so that people who are perhaps taking off garments can put everything back together before coming back out into sort of the public areas, they will pay for hand mirrors on a justification-led bid basis. So we need to tell them, here's the receipt, and they should give us the money. Other things are not as straightforward as that. And yes, there is a JLB, but of course we don't necessarily know at this point what they will say yes to. So there are going to be conversations with them about, look, we intend to do this, will you give us the money? That's a fairly standard thing with these kind of programs, as I understand it. That's really what I've kind of set out in my report, so I'm very happy to take questions if that's sufficient.
Coyote, is there anything you want to add to that before I take some questions?
Just a few things. We were listening to the item just before this one, and just to let you know that we are working with Tara and her team on co-production. We've looked at we're looking at venues in terms of disability access. How can people access them? We're looking at our furniture in terms of what furniture do we have. We're also looking at our communication in terms of the leaflets that we're sending out, not only in terms of size, but language and accessibility of the information that we have, so that people who English is not their first language might be able to understand the new requirements and how they'll be able to access their right to vote. So and we were just having that chat that what other things can we think of? So it's as an organization, we are a learning council, and we will also be looking at things that we can introduce to help the residents to access the right to vote. And one thing I would say is that the government has introduced new burdens on the council. Some of them, as Zoe has said, is going to be funded, but there will be gaps. And we need to be frank. And the lists of things that we are thinking of doing in terms of engagement that's going to cost us money that we don't have. So we will need to prioritize what we can and we cannot do. So that's the two things that I would say.
Thank you. Councillor Reid, do you want to come in now or later? Councillor Reid.
Yes, thank you very much. Councillor Rowan Reid, Cabinet Member for Finance and Reform. I'm here because electoral services and governance fall within my portfolio. Thank you very much for inviting me, Chair. I'm sorry that I wasn't here at the start of the meeting. I was actually in a community meeting in Conningham Ward, a little underdressed. I see even Nikos is wearing a suit tonight. But democracy, we obviously all believe in it. That's why we're here. That's why we've given up a nice sunny evening to spend our time in this meeting. We all believe in democracy. We want to make sure that everybody in this borough is able to exercise their democratic rights. And that's the most important thing about our response to these changes. We need to make sure that everybody who wants to vote is able to vote. Everyone who wants to have their say on how their community is run is able to have their say on how their community is run. Everyone who wants to be a part of the process is able to be a part of the process. Now, these changes, as you can see in the paper, have been complex. It's obvious that people around the country haven't necessarily got to grips with it. It's clear that the alterations we're going to have to make are costly. And so we are going to have to bear a burden as a council in terms of paying to make sure that people are able to access their vote. But you can't put a price on democracy, right? Our job is to do whatever we can to try and make sure that people are able to exercise that such fundamental rights, the right to vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? I saw Councillor Brockbank Fowler first.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Perhaps you could explain how, if someone comes to you for a voter ID certificate, how do you check that they are who they say they are? I mean, how does that process work if they don't have any of the other forms of documentation?
So it depends. But if somebody has a national insurance number, for example, then they will be asked to provide a photograph, their NI number, their date of birth, obviously their name, and the date of birth, national insurance number and their name are checked against DWP records via a government-run portal. So although we don't see that checking going on, we get a result that comes back and says, yes, this person matches. And obviously they matched their entry on the electoral register. So that's the same sort of process that would happen anyway with voter registration. If they then do not have a national insurance number either, then we are able to take various other forms of ID. So the problem is not necessarily that somebody has no ID at all. It's just that they don't perhaps have a passport or a driving license or the right kind of Oyster card or that kind of thing. But they might have for example, a utility bill and an Oyster card and another piece of documentation, but just not quite the right photographic ID. So we can take those in lieu of national insurance numbers. And failing that, I believe, we haven't had one come up yet, I need to check the rules, but I believe that you can also have attestation. So, which is where somebody else will say of standing can say, no, I know this person, they are known to me, and then they can sign that off. But that's only if the other things have been exhausted, and that's not an exhaustive list of people that can do that. So it's similar to registration, so that, yeah.
Obviously you've had relatively few people apply at this stage because we've had no elections, so there'd be relatively little reason to do it. My view is that the publicity that you're looking to do in this paper obviously will be supplemented and by for the mayoral campaign, for example, I mean, there will be a huge amount of publicity that we won't have to pay for as a council, and it'll be paid from elsewhere. And the government obviously will do a lot of advertising. There was a lot of advertising on commercial radio, even in London. I noticed during the May time. Because there were a lot of ads, on LBC and elsewhere. So I really feel that there will be very, very few people who don't know that they have to produce ID. Whether they remember to take it on the morning is a different matter. But obviously, if they're intent on voting, they will come back. But I was just, if we look at point 55 on page 35, the sort of suggestion that possibly there might be a household notification letter, I thought was perhaps taking things to an extreme, given that everybody will be notified in their council tax, which goes out in April, and the elections, our first elections won't be till May, and your digital, so on, and everything else that's going on. It's just that, as you said, there isn't a huge pot of money, and 30 to 40,000 strikes me as being an awful lot of money, which may, in fact, be wasted. Obviously, one might not know that until after the event, and that's one of those judgments. But could I just ask you to kind of look at that very, very carefully before undertaking expenditure of that kind that we residents obviously have to pay for? Thank you.
Sure. I mean, this is a sort of this is the electoral team's wish list. That doesn't necessarily mean that we anticipate doing all of those activities in particular. We used to in this borough do an H&R back in the 10, 12 years ago, where it wasn't just about voter ID, of course. It was about making sure that people knew who was registered to vote in their household. It was basically a second bite at the annual canvas cherry, and an opportunity perhaps to have a postal vote application put in, as well as other relevant information about where their polling station was and all that kind of stuff. So it was a useful exercise when we did it. It is costly. That's why we've not done it for a number of years. So yes, as I say, it's some of these are, if we had the money, this is what we would like to do, but it's whether or not the money can be forthcoming is a different matter.
One final point, because you mentioned that, given that was the case last year, I mean, our elections in 2022 was the prime opportunity to actually do that, because the boundaries had changed, and the polling stations all changed, or a lot of them did, which did cause confusion. So I can see that, look, it's progress. You're looking at trying to find new polling stations, and I know one of them is in my ward, so I know that you're having to look for that. But perhaps people could be notified when the normal registration goes round, if it's ready in time, because that goes out in September or October, doesn't it?
It does. You talk about asking for information about polling venues.
Yes.
It does, but those forms are prescribed. So unless we were going to do some sort of flyer for each polling district, which then gets very complex to do, we wouldn't be able to do that, because we are only allowed to, the form and the letter itself are prescribed. So that's not really doable, I'm afraid.
Well, perhaps it could go in the council tax leaflet.
Yeah, that's something we could take up.
Because there was an awful lot in there that didn't need to be in there, whereas something like that, it would be rather useful.
I will raise that with the comms team. Obviously, I'm not the editor of that booklet, but yes, that will be a decision taken by the people who are responsible for that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. I know Councillor Ree wants to come back, but just on that point, I think I'm not sure that I don't think the statistics are in here, but we have a very high turnover of people who move, and obviously getting the message to them. And for example, many of them may have a driving license or a passport, but in terms of like household bill cross-checking and things like that, if you're constantly moving, either because it's through choice or because you are in a precarious housing position and you're constantly moving, in some ways, those are the people that are the hardest to reach. So I think there's quite an issue there in terms of, I mean, Councillor Ree will come back on this, I'm sure, about, what's the price on democracy? And sometimes it's those individuals who most need to be encouraged to vote because they have a chaotic lifestyle, and how do we make sure that they don't miss out on that, because this is sort of a double whammy, really. Councillor Reid, you might want to answer both of those, but it just occurred to me in terms of what Councillor Brocklebank-Fowler was asking.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a really good point. We do have quite a high turnover in this borough, particularly in certain areas. And so we want to try and do all we can to make sure that everybody knows that they're able to vote and how they can go about doing that. Councillor Brocklebank-Fowler, I just wanted to respond to the points that you made directly. I think you're absolutely right to point out the difficulty actually in applying for the free voter ID card itself. And, we've been through the hoops that people have to jump through in order to get that. I can see how a lot of people might actually be put off from applying for the free ID card. And so may give up even at that early stage, right? It's a process that's fraught with opportunities to try and, almost stop people getting out to vote. You said that perhaps we don't necessarily need to do advertising locally, but as you pointed out, that it's some of this on here, yeah. But as you pointed out, there was national advertising ahead of the local elections that we just had in May, and we can see the results. Thousands of people were turned away from polling stations who then didn't come back. There was national advertising, and yet still people perhaps didn't hear it. Maybe they weren't listening to the same radio stations as you, but we want to try and make sure that as many people as possible can hear the messages and do know exactly what it is that they need to do in order to vote.
Councillor Ree, I was trying to illustrate that even though we didn't have elections in London this last May, London-based radio stations were advertising the fact that you needed to bring voter ID. So it was I mean, why they were doing that, but perhaps they're doing it to gradually get the idea across. Obviously, one has to have advertisements telling people and the posters and whatever. But the fact is that council is not the sole institution in charge of this. And more money will be spent by central government and by the GLA and so on and so forth. And every candidate and every political party, it is in their interests to highlight that on their own campaign material. So given that we go to every building, and so on, people will be getting this message time and time again, from three parties. So what I was just saying was that it's important always to keep an eye on the council finances and not overdo or duplicate what is going to happen from elsewhere. That was my point.
Absolutely. And, radio stations in Kent, in Liverpool, in all the places around the country where they were having elections this year will also have been putting out those messages. The facts just show that despite that, people didn't get the message. People weren't able to vote. People were turned away and weren't able to come back. So we need to make sure that there are as many channels as possible getting this message out. I'm glad to hear that you'll be going around the council estates across the borough spreading this message. We'll be doing the same.
Yes.
But we need to make sure that as many people as possible are doing that, and people are getting these messages from as many sources. I think. Sorry, Councillor, but I didn't.
Conversation here, guys. Can we have some questions? So, Councillor Reid, you want to wrap up what you were saying?
Just one more point to make. Unless Councillor Brocklebank-Fowler wants to interrupt again. I'm always keeping an eye on the finances. We are a ruthlessly financially efficient council. We're constantly looking for efficiency savings and making sure that we don't spend money where we don't need to. But this is an area where we need to spend money because you can't do democracy on the cheap, and we're definitely not going to do that.
Thank you. I'm going to take other questions now. Councillor Perez and then Councillor Daly.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Zoe and Coyote, for the report and the information that you're giving us in terms of the steps that you want to implement in terms of voter ID registration and awareness. Now, I have been, I'm aware of some communities that sadly, unfortunately, are not recognized by the Office of National Statistics. I'm myself a Latin American, and being Latin American, I know of the Latin Americans in London and in the UK, and I've alluded to this before with colleagues here. There's a coalition of Latin Americans in the UK that try to engage the Latin American community to participate in democracy and for them to exercise the democratic rights. Sadly, unfortunately, the Office of National Statistics doesn't recognize the community here in the UK because they don't think we are a majority, even though we're one of the fastest growing non-EU, we're one of the fastest growing non-EU migrant communities in London, or the 8th largest migrant group in London. Now, like the Latin Americans, there are other communities that sadly are not recognized by the ONS. And speaking to the coordinator of the coalitions of Latin Americans in the UK, he was giving me some interesting statistics. The GLA and the YouGov carried out a poll back in March this year, 2023, and these were the results. 95% of white Londoners were aware of these changes and were aware of the steps that they had to take to engage in future elections. 82% of BAME Londoners were aware, but there's a difference there in terms of that awareness. And 76% of EU Londoners were aware, but still there's a missing percentage there of people that are not fully aware of it. And 32% of Londoners had no idea whatsoever of these changes. So my concern is that we end up with a situation where our BAME residents, for example, or our EU London residents will not engage in exercising their democratic rights. I appreciate the steps that you're taking forward and that you will be implementing in terms of communication and letting people know about what they need to bring for future elections. But, and I know you alluded to community languages. So can you please tell me what specific steps will be taken in terms of raising awareness in community languages about what people can do to get that voter ID in place? And in particular, and I think this is something that the coalition is really working on, is in particular the free voter authority certificate. They feel that there's a particular message need to go out in community languages to raise awareness about this option, because we don't want our residents to be turned away and not to be able to exercise their rights. So thank you.
Thank you for that.
Sure. Okay, so sure, yes. So EU nationals, for example, in this borough, roughly 20% of our electorate. So this is important for us, not just the sort of minorities necessarily in terms of the numbers of voters we have in the borough, but we have a significant number of minorities in the borough, if that makes sense. In terms of community languages, what we'll probably be relying on more is actually the materials that are being produced by the GLA. They are spending something like, I think it's 1.55 million on the campaign across London. They're producing materials for us out in local boroughs that we can repurpose and reuse and resend. And I believe those are going to be in various community languages as well. I wasn't actually aware of that YouGov poll. I was aware of last August's. I knew there was one in March, but I didn't realise the results had come out. It sounds as though awareness has gone up slightly because of the work that they've been doing. But there is more to come, and we will basically be tapping into what they've done. Because I don't think, certainly in my team, we have the resources really to work out what all the messaging should be in all the different languages and things like that. That's not, we're a very, very small team. So what we're hoping to do is basically slightly borrow other people's work with their permission and reuse those resources, and also from the Electoral Commission. We do link to both the GLA website around voting, again, a bit close to the election, but we will be pushing people who need language support onto their website and to the Electoral Commission's website for their appropriate language. So we have links saying if you're, from this particular community, this is where to find the things in your own language here.
Councillor Ree.
Thank you very much, Chair. Councillor Perez, I think that's a really good point. And I was hoping you could perhaps share the statistics that you just read out with the clerk so we can make sure that we get them into the minutes and reflect them accurately. It's absolutely right. And it goes back to the point that Councillor Brocklebank Fowler raised, about the importance of having a variety of channels to get these messages out through. Not everybody will be reading council letters, not everybody will be listening to BBC London or whatever other radio channels these things are put out on. We need to make sure that there is a wide variety of voices making getting this information out there.
I was going to pick up on the point which was about the co-production on this. So I think that could actually be really relevant to make sure that there aren't communities or particular residents that lose out. I don't know quite how we do that in the time frame in an effective manner, but it does seem to be a way of trying to overcome some of those barriers. Hayden?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if Councillor Perez has a name of an organization that we can link to,
yes, please.
Then we could work with somebody within the organization so that the material we do have, we'll be able to channel it through to the community. And that's will be one way of us being able to work with members of that community.
Absolutely. There are lots of initiatives in the charity sector that have led recent campaigns. So definitely I can support that.
Thank you. Councillor Daly.
Thank you, Chair. As Councillor Ree kind of started with, the one thing that unites absolutely everybody in this building is this kind of belief in how important democracy is. And the one thing that none of us want to do is to disenfranchise anybody. And that's really why this is here. We live in a very noisy environment in London. You can, just by walking about, you can have anything up to 10,000 brand logos, imprints, marketing messages blasted at you. The idea that £5,000 could cut through in a few weeks is really optimistic in kind of this environment. I just want to ask a question. Zoe, what I should have started off saying was that I really liked this report. I thought this was really great and really brilliant to bring all of this together. I really feel quite a bit more empowered to kind of speak about this and to think about it. These challenges, I don't think, can be exclusively the owned by electoral services. I think that the one thing that unites us is this belief and this need to make sure that everybody gets their votes. And I wonder how we might think as PAC chairs about how the various areas of and offices and departments can respond to this. So as housing and homelessness chair, I know that the housing officers have a no wrong door policy, and that anybody can go and speak to them. And I'm wondering whether the training that you're talking about can kind of extend to almost like all officers. Like, let's imagine that we can have a kind of a no wrong door approach to that. And I wondered if that had been thought, I'm guessing that's been thought through, but how also how we can help with that. And then I had a second question, which was really one thing that really sort of seemed quite painful on the day was the number of places. I particularly read quite a lot about Knowsley because I'm from that part of the world. But there were challenges when people turned up with their ID that's not a good look, that doesn't look much like you. And so some people were turned away with that. There was quite a lot of confrontation. The one thing that people at those polling stations said was that they didn't have any support on the day. They didn't really know who they could talk to about that. And I just wondered whether we can take some of those learnings and what we're doing with that, what sort of support we can put there. Realize not much budget, but what support can we put there for the day? Thank you.
So from the first part of your question was around, can we widen our training for all staff? I am going to be doing an all staff briefing for the council in September. So that will literally be, all the council officers are invited to that, and so we can talk there about elections. We will not just be talking about voter ID, of course, but the other changes that the Act is bringing in. So that's around disability access and things like that in polling stations, changes to overseas voter registration, voter ID, of course, and also try and recruit people, because I'm very happy for people to come and work on elections teams and they don't all have to work for the council. That's fine. So all of that kind of stuff, yes. I would be delighted. The Q&A questions that I'm doing on voter ID are at the moment aimed at people who are either interested in working in a polling station or have previously worked for us at a polling station. But we are planning on running them, if they work, right through to kind of Christmas, New Year, so people can come along and learn as they wish, and they don't have to be council staff further on down the line. The first ones, I would rather, if I'm going to be embarrassingly bad delivering some training, I would rather that was in front of people who know me rather than members of the public. So that would be, my options there. The second thing, yes, about what kind of support was there in stations. Again, this is for the staff you're talking about. So we have Coyote is one, and various other people are around this room. We have polling station inspection teams, which sounds terribly clipboardy, but they are kind of managers who are trained to go and support, literally to go and support the polling stations. We are hoping to increase the number on that team so that there are more people available who can get to polling stations if there's any kind of incident or query or question or concern from either the staff or from voters. Indeed, if they got in touch with us and we're then worried about what's happening, we have somebody who's close by who can get to them. We're very fortunate in this borough that, we are, is it 1.5 miles by 3 miles or something? We're quite small, so we can actually get there. I can get there if needs be and sort out any kind of issues in polling stations, or at least one of my team can. The difficulties with photos not quite looking like the person, to me, that sounds like a training issue. It should be a common sense approach. It's like, okay, this is a few years out of date, but you're clearly still you. That's fine. If you look completely different, you no longer look at all like the person in the photograph, well, then at that point, yes, they may want to then turn around and say, well, actually, have you got any better ID? But really, that does sound to me like a training issue, and maybe a bit of a kind of an information thing to members of the public as well, which is like, please try and take the thing that looks at least reasonably like you, your most up-to-date passport, not the one that you had when you were much younger, maybe. Although it doesn't have to be, and I would say this because we are in a public venue, that the ID that you take does not have to be in date. It can be expired. It can be your old passport photo, so long as it looks like you. That's all that matters. So yeah, I mean, it will be training, and as I say, slightly increased polling visiting team to ensure that if there are issues, we are able to get to them quickly.
Councillor Vaughan.
Thank you, Chair. Just 2 or 3 smaller or large questions. I note obviously there's a lot of statistics were collected in the recent May elections, which has given us the numbers that thank you for the report, which is very interesting. In paragraph 34 about Walsall and Knowsley, for example, how will we, the first question is, how will we be able to collect similar statistics for Hammersmith and Fulham? Because as night follows day, some people are going to be turned away. It'd be useful to know how many they were, and also then how many actually came back to vote, so that we've got an idea of that. Second point was, I agree with Councillor Reid that we should be spending the money that we need to ensure that people can vote and know about the new rules. I mean, I think the point to make, of course, is these are brand new rules, and they will be brand new for people going to vote in Hammersmith and Fulham at the mayoral election next year. So clearly, whatever's happened this year is sort of irrelevant to a certain extent. They're going to be brand new this year. And of course, as the council, we are administering the elections, and it's going to be the council staff and people employed by the council who are doing them, and are going to have to put up with, potentially some angry people who aren't able to vote. So I think it's important that the council takes the lead that it should on that. But to do the appropriate thing, So what, sorry, aside from the sort of suggested expenditure, I wonder whether, is there any work going on either in your team or across the council to sort of sample whether people know and understand what the new rules are? Because in a sense, it might be better to be proactive to understand, I don't know what the sample would be, but in different parts of the borough, whether people are actually aware of the fact that there's a voter ID requirement, you know, so not, you know, do they have to take ID along? Because then you might be better able to sort of, I mean, clearly social media is going to be an important part, but better able to target the sorts of communications that you send, because you find that in one sort of demographic, it's clearly, you know, lots of people have not heard about it. And in other demographics, it's clearly, you know, they're listening to commercial radio and they know what, you know exactly what's going on. So I wondered whether, aside from the, you know, putting it out either as a household information letter or as a, you know, as part of the council tax, you know, if it's at page 12 of the council tax booklet, it's not clear whether people can read it. There are some more proactive ways that you could sort of sample which bits of the community. I mean, there must be learning from this year, but there must be ways of sort of trying to identify how many people really know about this, and then being able to better target at the sort of information we send out, so people are, you know, fully aware.
So to take the slightly easier question first, how did they know? They had a form this year in their polling stations called a VIDF, which was not to be mixed up with a BRF, I think. There were two forms. One, which is where somebody had been actually refused a ballot paper by the presiding officer because of the, you know, they hadn't they turned up with a piece of ID that looked nothing like them and weren't able to provide something that did. That was a sealed document and nobody had access to it. So the Electoral Commission introduced this thing called a VIDF, which I can't remember what the acronym stands for now, but essentially it listed anybody who was who didn't have ID at all with them to begin with. And then if they came back, they were then crossed off that list as having returned. That's how they knew about it. That actually was done with kind of a special set of election rules for this May. It is unlikely that that will be in place for next May's elections at the GLA. There is some there's mixed advice coming from the Electoral Commission. Mixed. It sounds to me from the Electoral Commission that there is not kind of legislative support for us doing exactly the same thing, and there are GDPR issues about whether or not we should be taking people's names and addresses who have turned up for to vote, and then we turned away and then come back again. Having said that, there are a number of electoral services managers and EROs across London that I'm in touch with and speaking to, and we are generally of the opinion that we still wish to do this anyway, and it will be a question of, we'll ask the voter, are you happy that we just collect your name? We think that probably covers us, but obviously that's subject to kind of further advice, and that will be the returning officer's decision and not mine. But I think that would seem to be a sensible thing to do, because we need to know who's being turned away. As to have we done research or sampling, no, we certainly haven't at the moment done anything like the YouGov piece of work that the GLA have done, which was literally asking members of the public, have you heard about this new change to the rules, and then going back and asking them again after they've done some advertising and the rest. It would be great to do that. I don't know quite how I would go about doing that. We are waiting at the moment for the Electoral Commission's report on the most recent election. So they were the people who put this VIDF sampling in place, and I would be hopeful that they will include in their analysis something about who were these people, in the sense of, okay, we know the numbers, but which communities did they come from? Was it from particular areas? Were there particular messages that did or didn't work well in those areas, so that we can borrow that and then overlay it on the information that we know about our own authority? We have looked very briefly, and I didn't have it available when I looked at the report, although I've since seen it, about the numbers of people in Hammersmith and Fulham without passports, for example, which is currently running, according to the census, the ONS figures, at about 3.9%. That's actually quite encouraging, because outside of London that figure is much higher, which means more people do not have a passport. So we have these kind of factors that we think will make a difference, but at the moment I'm waiting for that commission report to give me a better idea of what I need to be looking for from the kind of the desk exercise, if you like. But we could maybe think about talking to the community engagement team and see if they'd be willing to draw up some sort of questionnaire and maybe do a little bit of research for us like that with some actual voters. I think that would be a worthwhile exercise. So yes, thank you for the suggestion.
Can I ask, you've referred to it several times, when are you expecting the report from the Electoral Commission?
June.
So like now? Right, okay. The other question that I was going to ask related to where the elections were this year. I mean, obviously we have got a very diverse community in terms of languages, and I know we've talked quite a lot about language, but I'm just thinking that London and the mayoral elections next year, that's potentially a much bigger issue than it was in the elections that were just gone in terms of where the elections were.
Slightly testing my knowledge of where all the elections were. I know that London certainly did not have them. Birmingham did not have them. I think Manchester may have done. So that might be an interesting one to look at. But yes, obviously there is a big difference between, you know, district council in Surrey somewhere and Hammersmith and Fulham. Yeah.
And the other thing connected to that, which you might be waiting for the Electoral Commission report on as well, is how many people did actually request a private area to have their voter ID checked? Because again, there'll be some areas of the country, and I would think, you know, there might potentially be some people in our borough which would make that higher than sort of, you know, a district council in Somerset, for example.
Yeah, sure. I don't know is the answer. And I don't know if, I'm not even sure if the Electoral Commission were gathering that information or not. I mean, it's something that we could certainly, you know, do a 5-bar gate on ourselves come our own elections, and we probably will. But I don't know if that information has been either gathered or shared with the Electoral Commission at all. Yeah, I don't know. It would be interesting. I mean, I think we have to just take the approach that we expect all our stations to be able to offer that to everybody. And that's because that's the law. And so therefore it's the question of, well, it will be available. How many people will actually need to use it? I don't know.
Councillor Sluice.
Thank you, Zoe, for the report. Just to start with a few comments on the report itself, and then to move on the comments on the discussion we've had. Just to say, I had a few misgivings, for example, on the meet and greet staff. I read reports from volunteers and other organizations that were sort of scrutinizing the whole process across the country, such as Democracy Volunteers. And they were saying that, of course, while I can see the value of meet and greet staff, the problem was also that their role was not to record how many people were coming. So while I understand the benefit, if they would turn someone away and say, you know, come back, they were not recording how many people came. So I wonder whether that defeats the whole purpose of the exercise, at least at this stage where we're still trying to find out how many people are affected. Though I can see that maybe at later points, it may still be beneficial, you know, if people come back. Secondly, I'm glad you identified the, you said training, that will be the order of the day about who to turn away. And just to know that the same group said that a lot of people would turn away even they had valid ID, especially when that was from Commonwealth countries, such as Bangladesh and Pakistan. Perhaps people do not believe that these were valid forms of ID. So yeah, I mean, I'm not telling you something you don't know. Just training will have to be for staff, for everyone, and including, you know, people from the political parties, because there were also instances of party tellers turning voters away, which definitely should not be happening. And I'm sure, again, you know, I know our electoral services department is perhaps one of the best in the country, so I'm sure that we won't be falling into this sort of errors. Then just a few comments on the discussion we've had. It seems to me that linking or, you know, sending the household notification letter as part of the council tax booklet or as some sort of other communication just sort of defeats the purpose. What we need, or even, to be honest, even the A5 flyers sort of can go to every household. People may be registered or not registered or may not even be eligible to vote. As expensive as it may be, and sadly we have to go through an expensive process to make sure people can vote, any sort of personalized or tailored message to voters on social media, okay, it cannot be that tailored, but it still gets them to a website. But a letter, something that shows, because even EU voters, not all of them can vote, or they may vote in some elections. And of course, we may have the nightmare scenario of a general and a local one on May the 2nd, 2024. So just something on the booklet that is the same for everyone. And we've discussed before how, for example, we didn't want to encourage people to apply for the VAC if they already have ID, because it just increases the cost to the council and the bureaucracy involved. I think, and we have, you know, my casually dressed colleague across who would say that, yes, you know, our finances are sound enough for us to be able to do something that ensures that people can vote without bankrupting the council, of course. We've also discussed before, and you sort of allude to it in the report about new rules around postal votes. And I was wondering if you could just tell us a bit more about this public forum. Yeah, sorry.
I think there are a couple of questions in there somewhere, particularly about postal votes. I'm not sure. Are we going to stop talking about what people are wearing, perhaps? But...
Yeah.
Zoe, would you like to respond to Councillor?
Sure. So to slightly go backwards, postal votes. Yes, the Elections Act does not just change voter ID. It changes how postal votes are handled. So, for example, from later in this year, I believe, people will be able to vote or be able to apply for a postal vote online. We will be doing some beta testing on that in Hammersmith and Fulham with DLUC, and making sure that all works as well. So there's that change. There will be overseas voting for life is coming in, changes to emergency proxy rules. There's various bits and pieces that are coming in that add to complexity. What may be of interest to people around this table with regards to postal votes in particular is about postal vote handling. Candidates and agents will no longer be able to handle postal votes at all. Other than their own, obviously. People will not be able to drop in a postal vote to the town hall or to my office and just hand me the postal vote anymore. They will need to complete a form to explain who they are dropping off that postal vote. There will be a limit on the numbers that they are able to drop into us. And that process will also be replicated in polling stations. Which is why, you know, yes, we have voter ID, but presiding officers at polling stations also need to take that on board as well, that they have this other new process to take in. We're slightly unlucky in London, I guess, because, you know, other authorities have had the voter ID piece to go through once before all these other changes are coming along as well, and we don't. So ours is a bit more, we're taking on a few more changes at the same time. So yes, I'm very happy. I'd be very happy to come back and explain the other changes in the Act, because quite honestly, there are quite a lot, and I suspect we would time out if and they're not in the report either. There are changes coming down the line for both voters. How voting by post will, at least applying for that, will change. They need to renew their postal votes every 3 years, currently every 5. Things like that are coming down the line to challenge us as well. Tellers, as you know, from every agents meeting, tellers in Hammersmith and Fulham are very firmly instructed that they must only approach electors on the way out of a polling station. We will be obviously reiterating those rules to tellers and candidates and the agents as well, just to make sure that that continues to be the process. And that is partly the reason why, is we want to make sure that, yep, it's fine. Once they've left the polling station and had their vote, you can give them whatever information you like, and the job has been done and you're not impeding them in any way. So that was tellers. Commonwealth passports, again, that's a training issue. I'm perhaps thinking about that. We may try and get some sort of samples. Do you happen to, I'm asking you the question now, but we will try and find out if we know which countries in particular those were. We may be able to get sample passports so that staff are familiar with, obviously we're all familiar, most of us are familiar with the EU/British ones, but some other passports do look a bit different than ours, and it may be helpful for staff to see samples of those. Yes, general election GLA 2024. We are planning on the basis that that will happen, because we can't, if it were to happen and we hadn't planned for it, that would actually make us fall over, I suspect. So we are planning everything at the moment as if the two are going to happen together. We don't know. I suspect other people in this room may know better than me, but I don't know. So yeah, does that answer all the questions, I think?
It does. In answer to your question about IDs and which passports it was, the report mentioned Bangladesh and Pakistan specifically. And can I just ask one more question very quickly? Because yeah, I realize that we've spent quite some time discussing an issue, and we've spent quite a lot of money on solving an issue that may not have been there to begin with. And I think, you know, you're the person perhaps to tell us how many people have been found over the years to have actually fraudulently voted in Hammersmith and Fulham, leading to this problem that means dozens of meetings, training, hundreds of thousands of pounds, radio stations, and whatnot. Thank you.
So the only, you're talking about in polling station, which is what this is. Obviously, this is, I think that's happening in polling stations. The only case that I'm aware of in Hammersmith and Fulham was, I think, 2005 or 2006. I can't remember which of those two elections it was, where a gentleman tried to vote twice. Staff recognised him the second time he came in. And he was cautioned and accepted the caution. So we've had one proven case, if you like. Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Ree, before I come to the end of this report.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's important to say in that case, yeah, having a voter ID, you know, making sure the voters show their ID wouldn't actually have prevented that. You know, we were able to stop that happening before these changes were brought in. Yeah, it seems to me this is a solution in search of a problem. Yeah, I think there was the Electoral Reform Society found that there were, of the 58 million votes that were cast back in the 2019 general election, just 33 were for people who were trying to vote fraudulently. It seems to me that this is a measure that's been put in place not to try and stop a lot of people voting twice, but as we've covered in terms of the various groups who are perhaps more affected by the changes, who are less likely to be able to come and vote. It seems to me this is more an issue of discouraging some people from voting at all. That's why I think it's so important that the council, that everybody who wants to promote democracy in this country does what they can to make sure that people are aware of these changes. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask the committee to note the report, and I think take away some of the suggestions that have been made to the committee by the committee this evening about how we might do just small things to kind of make sure that what Councillor Ree has just described doesn't happen as much as we possibly can, because it is important that everybody, regardless of what their background or whatever their situation is, that they do get the opportunity to vote. So I think there's been some useful ideas that have come from the committee, which we've captured. But I also think just sort of putting that co-production bit in there to make sure that any connections we've got with groups like Councillor Perez was referring to, etc., and actually talking to our own co-production staff in terms of where they may suggest that perhaps you might want to just run through the literature you're putting out or something like that to make sure that it's really, you know, really is accessible, because sometimes we think we know, but actually we don't. So thank you very much for the report. And maybe when that Electoral Commission report comes out, you could perhaps circulate it to members of the committee, who I'm sure would be very interested to see what it says compared to some of the questions that they've raised tonight. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got one more item on the agenda to cover, which is the forward plan, which basically looks at some agenda items for the next meetings. And we have also looked through sort of, you know, the council's business plan to pull out some of the themes in there that perhaps have not been explored so far. Matt, do you want to say anything about this report before I just ask the committee to comment on the forward plan and sort of future items?
haven't got a lot to add to that, but it's hopefully the board will see it's a varied and interesting programme for the board, various areas of focus for the board's consideration over the next period. And it's a mixture of areas the board will scrutinise on the way to cabinet, but also areas where the board can support the co-production and development of some key areas of new policy for the council and key strategies. And some of those are new, some of those are issues the board has considered over the last 12 months. So yeah, the board's asked to just note the forward plan, and are there any further areas for consideration that you would like added to it?
Can I just put on record now, Councillor Brockbank-Fowler has raised the issue of the exam results, but I really need to make sure that that does go to Children's Services. So I've just put that on the record now, that we've not missed that in this process. Thank you. Does anybody want to comment about anything else? You'll notice for September we've got intergenerational practices. It's quite early stages in terms of what the council is developing around that, so it's a really good time for us to have input, I believe.
What does it mean?
Well, it's mainly about old people and young people interacting and how they can support each other in issues like isolation and loneliness and things like that. So it's a lot of work. The Youth Council are looking at it. So it's about how we bring those things together across lots of the work that we do in the council. And it is a manifesto commitment which we have not kind of delved into so far. Fuel poverty strategy is something that's on its way to cabinet, I believe, so we've got an opportunity to comment on that. Digital inclusion, obviously we've talked a lot about that. We need to make sure they're on track. I think it's really important that we as a board keep tabs of the financial situation and don't just do finance at the budget meeting, which is why I thought it pertinent for that to come. I'm going to take Councillor Ree and then Councillor Brockbank-Fowler. Councillor Ree. Sorry, Councillor Bull. Sorry.
Chair, I'd expect you of all people to be able to distinguish between myself and Councillor.
Yes, you're both very differently dressed today, yes.
Well, we're also both your colleagues in your ward, but anyway. All I'd say, sorry, is that there are a lot of things on the agenda for the 11th of September. So I wonder whether, we need to think about whether 4 things is enough.
Yeah.
Is possible in 3 hours.
Quite possibly, but I think certainly digital inclusion would be quite short, but yeah, we may move one of them. So that's was the thinking. Councillor Brockbank-Fowler.
Would it be possible to look at the housing, the financial reports on housing, because there's been an awful lot of movement going on in there. I'm sure it goes to the housing pack, but I think we need to raise it up because it's becoming an issue, with the Ombudsman coming round again. And, I really think that we need that, the HRA and whatever.
I will be encouraging all the packs to be looking at their budgets, but I don't know, Councillor Daly, do you have that on the agenda for your pack at any point in the near future?
Not for July meeting, but we are looking at it for the autumn.
Okay, so I think I'll liaise with Councillor Daly about that. I'm not suggesting no, Councillor Brockbank-Fowler, but I don't want to, if it's going to go to housing, I don't want it to go here as well just yet. But maybe we can look at it when we look at the budget a bit later on in the year, for sure. Yeah. Councillor Daly.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask a question about the digital inclusion. There's quite a large piece on digital transformation happening. There's quite a lot of work going into that, and I wondered if we could bring that along with digital inclusion.
I believe that one of the reasons why I got going on the digital inclusion in the first place was to make sure that we did actually have the two going hand in hand. But yes, we can certainly interweave those together. So yeah.
Lovely, thank you.
Okay. Anything further? I think we've got a few ideas there. I think it was very interesting. We certainly have quite a lot that comes up in terms of working with our partners, and we might want to give some thoughts about how we bring something relevant to this board in the future, because obviously it's very cross-cutting. And the one that sort of sticks out quite a lot is, a couple of people have mentioned it, is mental health. And how we work with partners across that, some very big issues. So that might be something that we could look at some point as well. So sorry, I'm just adding to this list, aren't I? But it's just things that come up. So, so is everybody happy to note the forward plan subject to those comments that just been brought up? Okay. Could I also ask you all to note the dates of the next meeting? Okay. Could I say thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and thank you to anybody that has been viewing us online. So good evening.